What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of HR Heretics. Today, we are back for part 2 with head of all things data, Peter Walker from Carta. Welcome back, my friend.
Great to be back, guys. Love a repeat invitation. It means something must have gone well the first time.
Yes, good to see you.
All right, so we're going to get into venture-backed everything today, and I want to first talk about hiring. The market still seems brutal. What are you seeing in the Carta data?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a different adjective to put on it than brutal, but I think you probably nailed it, unfortunately. We're looking at number of new hires, month over month on Carta. So give you some context. In January of 2022, the collective Carta companies, so that's 45,000 plus now, hired 70,000 people in a single month in January 2022. This past January 2024, they hired 27,000. Massive drop in new hiring. We think it's starting to pick up a little bit post the summer, although we don't have great data to prove that yet. But basically what that means is we read all the headlines about layoffs and departures and things. Effectively, like net headcount on the platform is flat since the start of 2023, which is a very, very different place than we were in 20 and 2021, obviously, but also very different from 2017, 2018, 2019, where there was consistent, solid growth in net headcount. So founders are just scrutinizing every single hire very closely.
Yep. Our team's actually running leaner. Like that's been the thing I keep hearing from board members and founders, which is just like, we are operating as lean as we possibly can. Is that just a soundbite, or do you have data that shows that it's actually reality?
I have data, but I also have a question about our own data, which I can't really answer, which is, so to take the first part, answer from us is yes. Take a Series A company. A Series A company that raised their Series A in 2020 did so with something like 20 full-time equity holding employees. In the first half of 2024, Series A companies were about 16 employees. So from 20 to 16. It's a pretty solid drop when you consider the percentage change there. And I think it's actually going to continue to get a little bit smaller. What I don't know is, are they supplementing that headcount with fractional consulting, offshoring, non-equity holding employees, things that I can't see in our data? My instinct is that they are to some degree, but I would expect that most of the time they're not really bullshitting you. Like they are running leaner than they used to.
Yep. What about level of role? So Kelli and I have a hypothesis that companies are like trimming the fat from this, call it like senior manager to senior director level, like these people who were only managing people before. And now like companies, given that they are running leaner, the expectation is you have to be able to operate at 70,000 feet and in the dirt. So are you seeing anything in the data that's saying like that's the section of the organization that's being cut?
I mean, yes and no. Look, the most likely people to be laid off in any layoff, according to our data, are the newest people. So regardless of level, new is the biggest criteria, is the highest correlated criteria than level. Although I will say there are obviously sub distinctions. If you're a VP that were just hired, you're still more likely to stay on than if you're an entry level folk that was just hired. Beyond that, I think that there certainly has been a bit of a hollowing out. We see it more on the hiring side. So if you look at of those hires that are still happening, the 30,000 or so in January, something like, if those hires had been hired in 2020, you'd expect probably about 50% of them to be ICs, another 40% of them to be managers, and then the last 10% to be, execs. In recent years, that's tilted more heavily towards ICs and early managers and less heavily towards, call it director and above. So is that part of the company being hollowed out? I think to some degree, yes. And certainly when we talk to folks, there is this renewed emphasis on you. There's no we're not hiring you so that you can set a strategy and hire a bunch more people and not actually contribute day to day to the work, especially at Series A, Series B places. I don't think it's been hugely dramatic. I think every layoff is different, but in aggregate, I do think that's a reasonable take.
Yeah. On the tenure correlation, Peter, it's interesting. Maybe I'm bringing out my HR semantics here, but you mentioned early tenured people is the biggest criteria. And in my years of doing a ton of riffs, not a ton, but a lot of riffs, we've never once looked at tenure as a key decision criteria of whether to keep or cut someone. Did you mean criteria in that way, or is it just happen to see that's the correlation your data is early tenure?
I don't know whether or not, I'll take your word for it that HR folks are not looking at tenure as a, input to the layoff calculations or the RIF calculations. I just know that empirically, if you look at the data, for instance, on tenure across startup companies, about something like half of all startup employees will depart within 3 years of joining. So, and in the recent years, those joiners have been much more likely to have left, and most of that is through layoffs. So are they actively like using that as the input criteria? Probably not. But I don't know. You would be better than me in terms of like what are the input criteria that's often used? Is it you're trying to get to a specific cash number? Maybe I'm not exactly sure how it works.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. I maybe some HR folks use it as a criteria. I never have, but
there's a term for it. It's called last in, first out. And I think part of the reason why, Kelli, that we see it is because we have more data on employees with tenure. So when we're doing a layoff, right, we weren't expecting to do it when we hired these people. We hired these people. Now they're in the building and we're looking at who do we have more confidence in with the team moving forward. And I think that's where that term comes from. It also, it's advice.
I'm familiar with it. I just wanted to clarify what Peter was talking about when he said criteria. And I was talking to a company this morning, Peter, about fractional, et cetera, and they were supplementing half their team with contractors, et cetera. So that's good. And my question for you is that would be really cool to see across the port, your companies. Do you all have plans to tackle that at some point, or is it just?
Well, if those employees are being granted equity, then we could. But my instinct is that there's a lot of non-equity agreements that are happening that we just don't see. So Carta is a fantastic resource for this sort of hiring layoffs, but we are almost always tracking employees that have some sort of equity ownership. So if you don't have equity ownership, it's kind of tough for us to see where you fit. And but I'm not surprised that you heard that. Like that's kind of what I had been assuming was happening. There's the other side of the story, which is both true and also way overplayed, of people like, we've automated entire apartments with AI. Like, who needs customer success anymore? All that kind of stuff. I think that's mostly bullshit for now. Now, will I have that same opinion in a year and a half or 2 years when people have really been able to automate functions a little bit more cleanly? Maybe not. But I think that most of it is a reaction to the fundraising market as opposed to some like long-term strategy vis-a-vis AI.
Yep. I want to go back to the last in, first out point. I get a lot of friends right now who are unhappy with their roles, with their jobs, with their managers, something like, and they'll always come to me and ask for advice. And one of the things that I tell them is be careful about the devil that you don't know, especially in today's market, because of and that's really interesting data now that I can point them to, because it's a dangerous time. Like if you do have job security, I'm somebody who's like always, I'm very risk tolerant. I'm trying to take more risk in my life. Now seems like a scary time to do that, given that there is so much turmoil in the venture markets. And so I want to like actually transition into that and to talk about the fund performance data that you guys have recently put out.
Nolan, actually, before we jump there, the point you just made is reflected in our data around voluntary versus involuntary departures, which is the nice way of saying, did you leave by choice or did you get laid off? The people who are leaving by choice, it's higher than the people that are getting laid off, thankfully now, but it's not that much higher. The gap between those two types of people is actually much smaller than it was in, say, 2019. In 2019, it was like 3 people left for every 1 that got fired. Now it's more like not 50-50, but closer. And I think some of that is exactly what you're saying. People who are dissatisfied with their current gigs are looking over the market and saying, I just don't want to risk it right now for an uncertain job that I may end up being on the chopping block for faster than I expect.
Yep. somebody just coined this term, the big stay, right? We had the great resignation, and now it's the big stay.
Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Real talk, most talent leaders haven't yet cracked how to leverage AI for meaningful impact on their hiring processes and business goals. But the leaders who are effectively using AI to transform their recruiting team's efficiency and quality use Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations, like intakes, interviews, and debriefs, then provides perfectly summarized notes of everything that was discussed. That means your people can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. But it's so much more than just a time saver, because perfect notes means perfect data. For every candidate and every pipeline, hiring teams can make confident, informed decisions, and talent leaders can finally take control of the interview process. Join forward-thinking talent leaders at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora, and check out Metaview. Head over to metaview.ai/heretics to talk to one of Metaview's product experts, or get started for free. You'll be up, running, and AI-enabled in minutes.
I do want to talk about this fund performance thing because it ties into what we're talking about here. So one of the things I think people don't understand about the venture ecosystem is that it's driven by investor returns, such that if investors don't make money, they won't invest further and the ecosystem will suffer. So what are you guys seeing right now in terms of fund performance?
Yeah, so I think it's actually sometimes useful for employees at startups to take a step back and think about the big picture like this, right? I am part of an ecosystem. That ecosystem has many different nodes and players in it. One of those nodes, one of the most important ones, is venture capitalists themselves. Where are they investing? Right now, we did a big report on 1,800 venture funds that use Carta as their fund admin. I think it's the biggest such data set for emerging managers anywhere in the world. So those are managers that are running funds, call it less than $100 million, which are disproportionately likely, as you can imagine, to invest into companies that are raising small rounds. So seed, Series A, et cetera. So this is a direct impact on those kind of companies, which has a direct impact on the employees that those companies hire. Right now, fund performance is not doing so high. As you can imagine, it's very closely, it has to be in some ways, a reflection of the broader startup ecosystem. So as valuations for portfolio companies go down, the valuation of the fund, the TVPI of the fund, also declines. We've been seeing that quarter over quarter since, the start of 2022. What's interesting is that the timelines in these things matter very deeply, and they're very different. If you're a startup and you can't fundraise, well, you have about 18 months to 2 years to figure it out. If you're a venture fund and you are envisioning being unable to fundraise in the future, you're still deploying that first fund for 3 to 5 years, and then you're probably at that fund. That fund is in existence for another 15 years sometimes. So the feedback loop for actual VCs is much slower than it is for founders. And that causes problems because, as you mentioned, a lot of LPs, the people who invest into these VCs, they're looking around venture and they're saying, I haven't gotten the returns that I was expecting. There's no recycled capital. If I'm Stanford endowment, sure, no problem. I just keep investing the way that I have been. If I'm a high net worth individual who just started investing into venture funds as an LP, maybe I do something else with my money. Interest rates are now much higher. There's a whole other universe of economic things I could do. And that puts a lot of these emerging fund managers at risk.
And the ecosystem, right? This is the thing that I don't think people are fully comprehending, which is if companies aren't doing well, or if they're not getting to liquidity moments and investors are losing money, they're going to stop investing into the space.
Yep.
And venture is a huge driver of employment. How many employees do you track through Carta?
Over 1 million.
1 million employees?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
This is a huge portion of our economy that I don't think is people are actually understanding. So I want to talk about the liquidity moments too. What are you seeing in terms of timeline to liquidity? And specifically what I mean is M&A and IPO, because that's when investors get their money back.
Yeah. So it takes forever. I mean, it's like a very long time between those two things. M&A on one side, most of the exits that happen to venture-backed companies are of the acquisition type, not IPO, as you can imagine. Very, very few companies actually end up making it to the NASDAQ. Within M&A, we've actually seen that it is fairly strong right now. It's not going down. It's rising quarter over quarter. Something like 150 companies or so get acquired off of Carta every quarter. So, that's a pretty decent number of companies, different decent chunk of things.
What was it like a year ago? Do you have at the top of your head what's gone up?
So like Q3 to Q3, a year ago was like 130. This year it's probably like 163. So solid increase in number of companies. The question is, what economic value is being generated through those acquisitions down to the cap table? And that's something that's actually pretty difficult, oddly, for us to see because the company basically leaves Carta immediately before they are actually acquired. So it's a little difficult to tell. Some of those are just going to be acqui-hires. Some of those are going to be basically your startup shut down in name or basically in practice, but in name you got bought. So it's not as though all of those acquisitions are actually resulting in tons of cash for the founder or tons of cash for the employees. I think actually most of them today are probably less remunerative to those stakeholders than they would have been in the past. And then the IPOs. Right now, in our data, it's something like 12 years to IPO from inception. And that's for the companies that obviously IPO, which is very, very, very few companies. And this year has the lowest number of tech IPOs in the last decade, I think. It's super low. So to Nolan, to your point, there's a lot of capital that is contained, has been invested into these companies, and investors are sort of starting to really get nervous about when they're going to make any money off of these names.
Yeah. And new investors, to your point about the ecosystem, Nolan, new investors might be very hesitant to even jump in the game, considering now the hill is steeper and you're hiking for a lot longer. So it's like a double whammy.
Yeah, and what Peter was just talking about too, so emerging fund managers. So if you go back to 2018 to 2021, everybody and their mother was starting a new fund. And, they're just starting to write checks. And that's, that actually drove a lot of the influx of capital into the ecosystem. Peter, it doesn't seem like these funds are doing well, number one. And then number two, it doesn't feel like if those funds are doing well, those people are going to be able to raise additional funds. Is that what you're seeing so far in the data? Do you guys have enough data to actually look at that?
We haven't really looked at fund shutdowns, but to pull a credible voice out of the ether here, Josh Wolf at Lux Capital had this theory that he's 30 to 40% of all emerging managers are going to shut down within the next 3 to 5 years, meaning they will no longer be VCs and they will be doing something else with their time. I think that's a little pessimistic, but not a lot pessimistic. There's definitely going to be a rotation out of many of those funds. And if they raised fund 1 or fund 2 in the boom times, will they be able to raise their second or third fund now? Probably not. Now, that sounds pretty bad. I think in taking my employee at a startup hat off and just a macro analysis perspective, what we were doing in 2020 and 2021 was completely unsustainable. So in some ways, this is going back towards ecosystem health. I do think that when we talk about ecosystem health, we tend to leave off the messiness that entails vis-a-vis layoffs, people losing their jobs, people not getting startup jobs in the first place, fewer companies being started, et cetera. There's a question, the eternal question around venture, which is how many companies at any one time are actually worthy of venture capital? Because it's a very unique, should be a fairly small segment of all quote unquote startups in a given ecosystem. Maybe we got over our skis and we were funding too many of them. That's cold comfort for employees who are working at some of them now. I think it's probably true, but I don't know what the right level of startup creation is for, say, the next 5 years.
Man, that's really interesting. Okay, so let's pivot a little bit to talk about employee compensation. Last time on the show, you had told us cash had remained about flat, but equity was down. What's going on with employee comp right now?
Honestly, the story remains pretty similar, which in some ways is good. So equity comp, for instance, has stopped falling, which is great to see. It's kind of leveled off about a third lower than it was in 2022. And, salaries picked up, they gained about, I don't know, a quarter, 0.5% over the last 6 months or so. So flat to slightly up on salaries and then flat for equity, thankfully, as opposed to like another giant drop from where it was in 2022.
Peter, do you all have data on global differences with equity? Right, I'm used to no one's been shifting their ranges, et cetera, based on, the global nature of things. And I'm wondering if that's picked up as a result of potentially lowering ranges in different geos.
We have some data on international equity packages. They tend to, at a bit of a slower pace, follow the US in terms of the trends. We don't have I don't want to speak too broadly because the density of the data is obviously much less in non-US countries, but we do see a kind of a similar thing. The other difference is, of course, equity in different countries functions very differently in terms of like the tax advantages, et cetera. It's not just like ISOs everywhere. So some of those distinctions may be obviated by the way that the equity is being granted.
Yep, got you.
Talk to me about company valuations. So we obviously saw a huge spike in valuations, during the, call it like 2017 to 2022 vintage. What's going on now, and how do those valuations relate to what we've seen historically?
They're honestly, the valuations at the earliest stages, seed and Series A, are pretty damn high still. They're actually maybe expensive, in my view. A seed stage company being valued at $14 million pre-money, that's basically where they were at the height in 2021. Now, the number of companies actually achieving those valuations is much less. So about half number of new rounds. But like early stage startups are being valued, especially if you're AI, in a very robust way, maybe a little bit less taking into account the effects of inflation on those dollars. But it's still like quite expensive. Later stage has fallen quite a bit. So the valuation of your average Series D company is much lower than it used to be. So if you just, one of the stats we put out recently was around unicorns, which is any company valued over $1 billion. In 2021, we saw 331 new unicorns that use Carta. In 2024, through the first half, we've seen 40. So not a lot of companies getting $1 billion valuations these days. In some ways, if you're an employee, like this isn't good, but it is clarifying in that if your company is receiving a $1 billion valuation today, it probably has much better underlying metrics than some of the unicorns that were minted in 2021, just based on how difficult fundraising is.
Totally. And of the 331 in 2021 that were unicorns, do you happen to know how many of those are left standing as unicorns?
Quite a few are, almost, the vast majority are still quote unquote unicorns. Some of that is because a lot of them just haven't raised again since then.
Haven't raised. So on paper, they are still, yeah.
On paper, they're unicorns. Are they, I don't know what the best term is. They're stale unicorns, perhaps, is a way to describe them. I imagine that eventually something like half of them will end up taking down rounds.
Yes. And on that note, I was really curious, and if you all track this, to what you're seeing with secondary markets and tender offers.
Yeah. So tender offers, there are two kinds of, secondaries that matter here. One we call sort of bilateral transactions, which is just individual people getting together and trying to affect secondaries. Carta doesn't do that, but we can see when it happens around a cap table. The other is tender offers, which is company sponsored events. So, people might be familiar with, say, Stripe doing this, where they say, look, we're not going to go public, but we want to give our employees some liquidity. So what we're going to do is we're going to host a tender offer secondary event where our employees can sell a portion of their stock and receive liquidity without us having to go public. Those are trending up from a low base of 2023 when there was very little activity. Trending up, they kind of seem to follow the late stage valuations. As late stage valuations get higher, secondaries pop up a little bit more. And secondaries are very concentrated in Series C and D and beyond. You don't have a ton of secondary transactions in a Series A company. So those are happening. The buyers and sellers are still generally a little bit further apart than you would have expected, in normal times. But it's a route out. It's just candidly, like, none of these liquidity mechanisms make up for the lack of IPOs. IPOs are their own sort of gigantic events that really spur recycling throughout the venture ecosystem. So yeah, there's ways to get around some of this, but we won't really be healthy until companies start IPOing.
Do you have a sense as to why they're not? Like, I'm looking at the S&P right now, and it appears to be ripping. And it's, it feels like if you just invested in the S&P 500 index, you'd be doing quite well over the last couple of years. But I keep hearing IPO markets are closed. Like, where is the dissonance? What am I not understanding?
My instinct is there are two reasons for this. So one, if you like subsegment that S&P, like how much of that growth is actually concentrated in 7 names? And really, if you're just talking about the broader swath of SaaS companies, they haven't actually been performing that well in the public markets. The second reason is that some of the best names that you would expect to IPO don't need to. So if you're Stripe, why IPO? What's the point? You have unlimited capital here in the private markets. You can affect those tender offers so that your employees stay liquid and responsive, or are excited about the company, and you avoid a bunch of oversight. What's wrong with that? So I think for the biggest possible names, IPO is actually in some ways just taking on a regulatory burden that you may not need to do. That doesn't apply to very many companies, but it applies to the most well-known companies. And that's kind of, as you think about a regulatory challenge, making going public more attractive to the best names would be something that I think probably deserves some look.
Damn, I had never considered that. So you're basically saying if you're Stripe and you're able to get liquidity to your employees, you're able to get liquidity to your early investors because there's demand in the private markets for your equity. What is your incentive to go IPO? I had never considered that, but I'm actually like struggling right now to figure out what that incentive would be.
And to others like Stripe that are in similar positions, why did they go IPO? Best thing I can think of is people, have dreams of seeing their name on the.
Well, access to capital is the primary argument, but the best names actually don't struggle to have access to capital, and they've over the last few years have raised a shit ton of money. So like their coffers are probably already full. And we're entering an era of AI to where theoretically they can get more operational leverage such that they won't be spending as much as they had been spending in the years past. Damn, I had never thought about that.
I think to be clear, this is a very elite problem, right? Like there are not that many companies for whom the private capital markets could suffice forever or that have that much interests. So in some ways, the need to IPO would maybe be stronger in that like second tier of late stage firms. But yeah, I mean, I think part of this is just the gigantic growth of private capital over the last 10 years where, OpenAI is funding a what size $1 billion round with, a bunch of people. You have to write a
$100 billion plus rumored
$250 million check to get in the door. Like the fact that kind of capital is available to them as a private company is leagues beyond what would have happened 10 or 15 years ago. So in some ways, this is a story of just the growth of private markets as a whole. And, eventually you run into this problem where the point of the public market is that retail investors can take part in the growth of some of these tech companies. I think that's important for us as a country. I think it individually kind of like makes it hard to make that case to some founders who are like, why would I do that?
Man, that's so interesting. Okay, I want to go back to a comment you made around the seed data that you're seeing. So you said about half the number of new rounds as you did like during peak. What does that data look like for the rest of like Series A and beyond?
Similarly, down. I think it's actually a little bit down further the closer that you are to IPO. So the downturn hit the closest to IPO companies fastest in terms of new rounds, total raise, et cetera, as people kind of reset their expectations. That, some of this is just a question of what is normal. Is it useful to compare ourselves to 2021, or was that the sugar high? And actually, where we are right now is quote unquote more normal, even though it feels much more difficult, obviously, if you're using that peak as a reference point. I think there's actually probably some legitimacy in that. It's not just investors trying to calm founders down. Like this is a more normal ecosystem outside of some AI bubble infrastructure stuff. So it's just a question of whether or not those rounds will continue to pick back up. And some of that is outside the control of all participants in this ecosystem. I'm thinking specifically here of the Fed. Like if you plot venture rounds against the Fed interest rate, like the correlation is not 1-to-1, but it's pretty inversely correlated. So, hey, a 50 basis points cut, what does that mean for venture in 2025? I don't think it means anything bad for venture in 2025. We'll put it that way.
Peter, I'm curious how the sugar high of 21, as you put it, correlates to what I felt was a sugar high when I was in a CPO role in 2014, 2015, 2016, which also felt like a pretty big sugar high. I just haven't really compared the two. Anything off the top of your head between those eras?
Our data isn't amazing back to 2014 or 2008, so I don't have great numbers here. When I think one of the distinctions between those two periods was, well, twofold. One, and 2021, we're basically at the end of 10 years of very, very, very low interest rates. So like the accumulated capital expansion there is very high. And the second is, of course, the pandemic, which I think it's underrated after the initial scare of April 2020, what the pandemic did to venture, where I'm not sure if it was because everyone was at home and it's all you could do or what, but like crypto, venture, things went bonkers over those 18 months. I mean, there were multiple deals that, you would probably, the participants now would look back and say, the moment I signed that, I knew that was overvalued by 300%, right? And it's just kind of like you get caught up in a wave. So the pandemic had a whole host of other more significant impacts, obviously, on health and everything else. But for venture, I think it was like a before and after sort of moment.
Yeah, it feels like we're in a moment of resetting expectations as to what, like, especially for employees, about like what working in venture actually is. And the stuff that you're describing right now is actually leading me to a hypothesis. But I want to actually first ask about shutdowns. You said, basically half of the rounds are getting done roughly that we saw during peak ZERP. We're seeing an uptick in M&A, which may be attributed to either companies shutting down or acqui-hire sorts of things, which is kind of what I'm hearing and what my belief is. What's going on with company shutdowns right now?
They're definitely up. They're rising. 2024, the first half of 2024, more companies shut down on Carta than we'd ever seen in 6 months. Now, that sounds bad, and it isn't good, but it also has to be taken relative to the total, data set size that Carta has access to. So more companies have joined Carta and more companies got funded. And so therefore we would expect shutdowns to be generally higher unless the percentage of startups that actually make it out would increase. And there's really no reason why you would think that. So if 9 out of 10 startups are going to shut down, then that 90% shutdown is going to happen. If it happens on a bigger data set, then obviously the absolute numbers are going to be higher. I do think you're at a very acute point in shutdowns, though, where we are about 2.5 years past the real downturn beginning in early 22. And maybe it really didn't take hold in venture and people weren't really hip to it until mid 2022. So 2 years on, that's a pretty interesting mark, right? Companies would have had to do one of three things. One, change their business, keep fundraising, like make it out. Two, change their business, but venture investors are no longer that interested in them, or maybe their business doesn't work with high interest rates. And then you have to bridge or extend or struggle along. Or three, try to do that pivot, fail, and then shut down. It takes a while to do those pivots and do that trial. So I'm not surprised that more of those, say, unicorns haven't shut down yet. They have one, they had a lot of capital on the books, and two, they had some time to make these changes. I think the rubber hits the road in the next year, where it's like either you made the changes and you're going to continue as this kind of business, or you're looking for a path out. Maybe that's an acquisition, or maybe you have to shut down shop. So it kind of feels like we're over the biggest hump of this, but we still have more after effects to experience.
Yeah, I do feel like the heat's getting turned up in the kitchen on kind of like, what's it going to be? Tender secondary IPO, M&A, raise.
Some of that heat is coming from younger companies, right? So like investors don't have to keep investing in the companies they've already invested in. They can, if you're a Series A investor, you can say, look, you raised your seed round in 2021. You're growing 40% a year. Here's this company that raised their seed round 8 months ago. They're growing 300% a year. It's just a different sort of thing. You have to compete with all of the younger cohorts that didn't have this valuation overhang to put on their cap tables. They're coming up clean, and that's hard.
Totally. Yeah, it is. And I know, this show's about the data and all the data you swim in, Peter, and I love it. But anecdotally, a lot of employees in these companies are also starting to ask, what are we doing here? What's it going to be? And I feel like that pressure is getting turned up as well.
I totally agree with you, Kelli. And this kind of goes to my hypothesis that I was referring to earlier. So if you have more shutdowns, fewer new rounds, a little bit more M&A activity, which is basically attributed potentially to acqui-hires, it seems to me that the thing that we're going to see next is this like talent consolidation phase, such that the biggest and best companies are going to continue to acquire great talent, because it felt like, call it during the last 10 to 12 years, talent started to get distributed. And there was this great talent was kind of going everywhere. I had friends at all different sorts of industries and sectors. But now, given that you have, and the other piece is less liquidity, right? So what you just mentioned, Kelli, if I'm an employee and I have my pick of the litter, one of the things I'm starting to think about is like, who can actually like get my equity worth real dollars?
Yes.
And so when you think, it just feels like the rich are going to get richer during this next phase.
I think that's a completely reasonable hypothesis of the world. What it mandates, though, is that the elite are going to hire in a way that they used to, whereas maybe they won't. My instinct, candidly, is to be like, look, if fundraising is going well and if fundraising in general pops back, hiring will pick up. I don't know if we as human beings are able to be capital efficient when some external force is enforcing us to, right? Like people will probably start throwing headcounts at problems again if fundraising got materially easier. I think I deeply believe that. We haven't solved our ability to like get into bubbles. However, I agree with you that I think talent consolidation is one aspect of this that's probably going to happen over the next 1 to 2 years. And then it's really incumbent upon the employee to say, yeah, where is my equity likely to be worth something? And then also, which companies are thinking strategically about liquidity and how are they thinking about liquidity? I mean, we've seen some models.
And they have a story for it. Yeah.
We've seen some models lately that popped up that are different. Like OpenAI does not have standard ISOs, right? So there are ways in which you could build equity that doesn't exactly look like ownership does today, but offers the employee enhanced chances for liquidity. As an employee benefit, I know that I would be looking for that as an employee. I hope that if you're in the enviable position of being sought after by multiple startups, that's one of the things that you're asking.
And crypto as well. That's a different model, which is interesting with the token model and more frequent. To both of your points, and I just talked to someone this morning, I also think we're probably going to see talent flocking to different industries than before. Do you know what I mean? Crypto, security, AI, life sciences, right? These industries where they're doing well. To your point around companies that can get them liquidity, et cetera. I'll speak for myself. I mean, I've been enterprise SaaS for a while. It's like, oh, maybe you go somewhere else. Like, I think you're going to see talent more diversified outside of maybe where they've lived the past 10 years.
Yeah, I don't think SaaS is going away. Maybe it's changing pretty significantly.
Sure.
But there's also a question around venture capital, like as the default pathway for a lot of these startups. Never really should have been the default pathway. And honestly, it really never was, except for we in VC-backed startups are very good about talking about ourselves. So it kind of feels that way if you're online. But in general, there's a ton of companies that are going to get started, look at the VC funding model and go, not for us. Now, what those companies do to incentivize employees in terms of ownership, they can still do very interesting things with equity. They just don't have a lot of investors, and maybe they're growing at different rates than your standard VC-backed company. But it's a cool and interesting time to, hey, if I'm a founder, can I bootstrap this to an amazing exit for me and for my employees as opposed to for my investors?
Yep. Last question for me, Peter, is around how much of the equity is going back to the pool. So let me just refresh. We had this conversation last time, but when you leave a company and you have unvested options, that those options go back into the pool. But even for your vested options, which is where I want to focus the question, most companies have a 90-day post-termination exercise window, which means that you have 90 days to shell out a bunch of cash to ensure that the options that you earned are still yours long past those 90 days. Of the vested options, what's being returned to the pool right now? Do you guys have data on that?
We do. So in this data set, we look at the percentage of options that have been vested that were exercised before their vesting period expired. So why would that period expire? One, because they've been there for 10 years, which is very, very few people, or two, they left the company, either by choice or through layoff. So in that 90-day period, effectively what this chart is showing is just in that 90-day period, what percent of folks actually exercise their equity and take full ownership of those shares. Right now, that percentage is like 34%, which means that a lot of equity is returning to the pool. At the peak in 2021, it was more like 60%, 55, 60%. So the drop it's about half as much. Why is that happening? Some of it is good financial decision-making by those employees. They're saying, look, I'm getting laid off. I don't believe in the prospects of this company. Why would I shell out cash right now for something I don't believe in long-term? Some of that is probably an inability to come up with enough cash to buy the options that they want. And then the third thing is either a lack of education or a misapprehension about where the company is going. My instinct is that a lot of these decisions are being made by employees and they're good financial decisions. There's obviously a portion of it where I'm sure that they wish they could exercise. My only, point on all this, and it's the same one that I've made before, is just that 90 days is a silly amount of time to have to make this decision. I know why it exists. Please don't at me. I get the tax implications, but I personally believe it's too little amount of time. So Nolan, this at Carta, our vesting schedule is indexed to how long we've been at the company. So you get more time if you stay longer. I think that's fair. I think there's a lot of ways to make this slightly more fair to employees.
Why does the 90-day exist? I thought it was just because it was always that way.
It exists because it is part of the requirements in order to use an incentive stock option versus a non-qualified stock option. So it actually, over 90 days, you can't have a vesting period over 90 days and still use the ISO. It converts into an NSO. So it has different tax implications. That is why is that a criteria? No idea, really. Still, it's something that, founders and others can work around. And I've heard the other side of this debate, which is, look, if you, for instance, gave someone an infinite exercise period there, it's very difficult for the company to plan because they don't really know how much of the pool is used. And I'd say, well, one, they worked there, they earned that. So
yeah, you allocated it anyway. You gave it out.
You did allocate it. It's kind of weird to be like, I allocate this amount of equity with the significant expectation that most of that's coming back to me. It's a little odd as a model.
It's insane.
Yeah. But, and I do sympathize with founders here. Yes, it is kind of difficult to manage your pool there, but 90 days, especially if they got laid off and they weren't planning on leaving. If they're planning on leaving, maybe they have some time to save up some cash. If you just get laid off and then you have 90 days, it's pretty ridiculous, honestly.
I have such strong feelings about this, as we know. So
yeah, I think all of us share the same thoughts. Peter, this was great. Where can people find you online?
I'm just lurking on LinkedIn mostly. So that's probably the best place to start. But you can also, love the time for the plug here, Nolan, thank you. We just kind of redid our homepage for all of our data. So all of our published research, a ton of podcasts and cool aggregated, anything that we do that we talk about data is now at carta.com/data. So very easy URL. Check it out. You can follow us there as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the time, Peter. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Peter. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you both.
Good to see you. HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment of Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.